History loves a last stand. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid gunned down in Bolivia, 1908. A perfect ending. But here's the thing about perfect endings. Someone has to write them. When forensic experts finally dug up those Bolivian graves, they found two strangers. The bodies weren't them. This isn't a story about how two outlaws died. It's the story of their final con, the meticulous plan to sell their own deaths to a world that desperately needed them dead. They'd become too legendary to live, too smart to die, so they gave the Pinkertons their ending, gave Bolivia its victory, and gave history its perfect legend. In exchange, they took the only thing left to steal, the chance to disappear. Tonight, we'll follow the two men who understood that the best place to hide isn't in the shadows, it's inside a legend. If you're drawn to history's darker corners, where the truth is a carefully constructed lie, consider subscribing. So take a slow, deep breath, settle in, and let me tell you how two legends died in Bolivia, and how two ghosts walked away. They weren't born criminals. That's the first thing you need to understand. Robert Leroy Parker came into this world in 1866 in a cabin in Beaver, Utah, the eldest of 13 children born to devout Mormon pioneers. His parents, Maximilian and Annie, had crossed the plains seeking Zion and found instead the hard arithmetic of frontier poverty. Too many mouths, too little land, and a God who seemed to bless everyone but them. Young Roy, that's what they called him, grew up believing in the promise of honest work until he watched his father lose their ranch to a man who understood that in America, legal papers mattered more than sweat or prayer. The boy learned a different catechism after that, from a ranch hand named Mike Cassidy, who taught him that cattle wearing one brand could easily wear another if you knew how to work a running iron. That banks which foreclosed on desperate families kept their money in vaults that weren't nearly as strong as they looked. That the real crime wasn't taking what you needed, it was being too weak to take it. By the time Roy Parker became Butch Cassidy, adopting his mentor's name like a benediction or a curse, he'd already learned the lesson that would shape his life. The law protected those who owned things, not those who needed them. It wasn't rebellion that drove him to crime. It was recognition. A clear-eyed understanding that the game was rigged, had always been rigged, and the only choice was whether to lose honestly or win dirty. The moment he truly understood this came during what should have been a simple horse theft. He'd taken a mount that wasn't his, everyone did it, trading horses like borrowed tools across the Utah frontier, but this time, the owner pressed charges, not because the horse mattered, but because young Parker didn't. He was nobody. He had no connections, no protection, no name that mattered. The judge sentenced him to 2 years in the Wyoming Territorial Prison in Laramie, and in that stone cage, something crystallized in Butch's mind. It wasn't shame exactly, nor rage. It was something colder, the thrill of finally understanding how the world actually worked. He was good at crime, better at it than he'd ever been at ranching. It was like discovering you could speak a language you'd never been taught. Harry Alonzo Longabore's path to the outlaw life was different but ended in the same place. Born in Pennsylvania in 1867 to a family that specialized in disappointment, young Harry drifted west like smoke, working ranch jobs, learning to handle horses and guns with equal skill. He was 15 when he reached Wyoming, a kid trying to become a man in a place that specialized in turning boys into corpses. His transformation into the Sundance Kid came courtesy of 18 months in jail, again for horse theft, in a town called Sundance, Wyoming. The name stuck like a brand. But where Butch learned charm and planning in prison, Sundance learned silence and violence. He came out of that jail knowing how to make men nervous just by being still, how to end a conversation with a look, how to be the period at the end of Butch's elegant sentences. They found each other the way magnets find iron, inevitably, almost against their will. It was 1896 when their orbits finally collapsed into each other, somewhere in the Browns Hole region where Wyoming, Colorado and Utah pretended to have borders. Butch was already building what would become the Wild Bunch, but he needed someone who could do what he couldn't. Someone who could be still when Butch needed to move, silent when Butch needed to talk, deadly when Butch's charm ran out. The comfort between them was immediate and wordless. It was the recognition of finding someone who understood that you were both broken in compatible ways. Butch would plan the jobs with an artist's attention to detail, choreographing robberies like ballet. Sundance would stand beside him, radiating the kind of calm that only comes from absolute certainty about violence. Together, they discovered something neither had found alone. They were better as a pair than they'd ever been as individuals. It was the kind of partnership that made them rich. It was also the kind that would make them too famous to survive. Then came Etta Place. History wants her to be a mystery, but the truth is simpler and sadder. She was probably a teacher, possibly named Ethel, definitely tired of teaching children whose futures were as predetermined as train schedules. When she met Harry Longabaugh, she saw something the wanted posters missed. A man playing a role he'd grown tired of, looking for someone to be real with. She wasn't a victim. That's what the dime novels got wrong. Etta Place, and she chose that name herself, like an actress selecting a stage name, was a willing participant in the entire enterprise. She could shoot, ride, and plan as well as any member of the Wild Bunch. But more importantly, she understood something both men needed: how to pretend to be respectable when the con required it. She was the one who taught them to use the right fork at dinner, how to sign hotel registers without arousing suspicion, how to look like they belonged in places they were robbing. The three of them formed something that wasn't quite a love triangle. It was more complex and more practical than that. Etta loved Harry, certainly. But she and Butch shared something too. An understanding that this life they'd chosen was both freedom and trap, both victory and countdown to catastrophe. In photographs from their time in South America, she stands between them, and you can see it in her eyes. She knew how this would end. She was there anyway. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First came the Golden Age, the years when the Wild Bunch turned train robbery into art. They'd blow the express car safes with dynamite. Too much dynamite, usually, sending money floating down like snow over the Wyoming sage. The Pinkertons spent $50,000 hunting them, over $1.5 million in today's money. They created the first wanted poster photography system, distributed descriptions by telegraph, hired informants in every dusty town from Montana to Mexico. The irony was perfect and poisonous. The more successful Butch and Sundance became, the more impossible their lives grew. Every headline that celebrated their exploits. Wild Bunch strikes again. Tighten the noose. They weren't just outlaws anymore. They were brands, as packaged and marketed as any product the railroad barons sold. The Pinkertons had turned them into celebrities, and celebrity, they were learning, was just another kind of prison. By 1901, the mathematics had become undeniable. The West was shrinking. Telephones were connecting towns that had been islands. The railroad had won its war against geography. There were no more holes to hide in, no more roosts for robbers. The frontier was closing like a fist, so they ran. Not in triumph, but in exhausted recognition. They boarded a steamer in New York, using aliases and forged documents, bound for Argentina with a dream of buying a ranch and going straight. Butch had his arm around Etta's shoulder as the ship pulled away from the dock, and witnesses said he looked back at the American shoreline with an expression that wasn't quite regret and wasn't quite relief. It was the look of a man saying goodbye to someone he'd loved and hated in equal measure. They actually tried to make it work in South America, bought land in Patagonia, raised sheep and cattle, lived under names that weren't their own, Mr. and Mrs. Harry A. Place, and their friend James Ryan. For a few years, they played at being ranchers, the same dream that had failed for Butcher's father, now being attempted by his son on a different continent, under a different name, with the same result. Because here's the thing about going straight when you've been crooked. Honest work pays honestly, which is to say, barely at all. The ranch struggled, the sheep got sick, the calculations that had made crime so profitable, risk versus reward, investment versus return, made ranching look like a fool's game. They were good at crime, they were mediocre at everything else, or maybe that's too generous. Maybe they weren't just bad at honest work, maybe honest work was bad at sustaining them. When you've tasted the adrenaline of a perfect heist, when you've felt the weight of stolen gold in your saddlebags, when you've been legends, how do you go back to counting sheep and mending fences? The old habits pulled them back like gravity. A bank here, a payroll there. They told themselves it was just to keep the ranch afloat. Just temporary. Just until things improved. But things never improve for people who are running from themselves. By 1908, they were right back where they'd started, planning one last job that would set them up forever. It was always going to be the last job. That's what everyone who dies in this business tells themselves. Just one more, and then we'll quit. Just one more, and then we'll be free. They weren't born criminals. They were made by economics, by circumstance, by one bad choice that led to another until the path back disappeared in the dust of their own escape. But here's the thing about choosing the outlaw life. You don't get to choose when it ends, unless you're smart enough, desperate enough, and loyal enough to fake your own death. Unless you understand that the only way to stop being hunted is to give the hunters what they want, a corpse. Unless you're willing to kill the men you used to be to become the ghost you need to be, then you choose everything, including what you lose. November 1908, San Vicente, Bolivia. 2 American bandits rob a mining payroll. The Bolivian cavalry tracks them to a boarding house. Gunfire erupts. When morning comes, 2 bodies lie inside. The authorities display them briefly. Yet somehow, no photographs exist of the corpses of the West's most wanted men. They're buried in unmarked graves. The Pinkerton Agency, which had spent $50,000 hunting these men, closes the case within days. The Union Pacific scratches names off ledgers with the satisfied sound of accountants who've finally balanced impossible books. Everyone needed them dead. Everyone got what they needed. 83 years later, forensic anthropologists dig up those unmarked graves. The bones tell a different story. Wrong age. These men were too young. Wrong height. Too short by inches. The DNA tests come back inconclusive, which is science's way of shrugging. The bodies in those graves weren't Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which means someone sold the world a death. Around 1909, not long after those shots echoed through San Vicente, a mechanic appears in Duchesne, Utah, calls himself William Henry Long. No past anyone can verify, no references that check out, but he has money, enough to buy property, enough to set himself up in business. He's quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from discipline, from swallowing stories that want to escape. The evidence whispers rather than shouts. Years later, Long's son would mention his father's bullet scar, a peculiar scar in exactly the spot where the Sundance Kid had been wounded in a robbery years before Bolivia. Long's wife was named Etta, the same name as Sundance's companion, who disappeared from history right around the time Mrs. Long appeared in Utah. There are no photographs of them together from before 1910. No marriage certificate under those names that predates Bolivia. The timing fits. The money fits. The silence fits perfectly. Think about what Harry Alonzo Longabore gave up to become William Henry Long. His name, the very sound of who he'd been. His family back east. Siblings who would mourn him based on headlines and hearsay. His reputation. The legend he'd built bullet by bullet. Robbery by robbery. He must have read his own obituary in the papers. Imagine holding that newspaper, seeing your death described in detail, feeling the temptation to write someone, anyone, to say the words burning in your throat, "I'm alive." Instead, he'd fold the paper carefully and throw it in the fire, watch his name turn to ash and drift up the chimney. The tragedy wasn't that he escaped the noose, it was that he imprisoned himself in silence. Every story of the wild bunch that spread through saloons and parlours was a story he could never claim. Every dime novel that made him famous was a fame he could never acknowledge. He had money but couldn't explain where it came from, had skills, with horses, with guns, with reading the landscape like a map of possibilities, but couldn't claim the adventures that taught him. Sunday dinners became exercises in creative emptiness. The children would ask about his past, the way children do, innocent and insistent. "What did you do before, Papa? Where did you come from?" And William Henry Long would smile that practiced smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes. Under the table, Etta's hand would find his, a squeeze that said everything. Keep swallowing, keep smiling, keep the story down where it can't destroy us. The weight of those unspoken stories pressed against his teeth like a flood against a dam. All those adventures, those close calls, those moments of wild freedom racing across the desert with nothing but dust and dreams behind them. All of it had to stay locked inside. He'd sit there, cutting his roast beef with deliberate care, while inside him Sundance screamed to be let out, to tell just one story, just once, about the time they robbed the Union Pacific and the dynamite blew too much of the express car and money fell like snow across Wyoming. But William Henry Long just chewed his food and swallowed his past. Etta's burden was different but no lighter. If she was indeed Mrs. Long, and the evidence suggests she was, then she carried every secret Harry couldn't tell. She could have written the memoir that would have made them rich all over again. Publishers would have paid fortunes for the true story of Etta Place, the woman who rode with the wild bunch, who stood between Butch and Sundance in those formal photographs where everyone pretended to be respectable. Instead, she spent decades practicing the pause before saying long instead of Longabore, catching herself before stories that began with, "Remember when," and transforming them into, "I heard once that," as if these were tales that happened to other people in other lives. The intimacy between her and Harry became the intimacy of shared erasure. They knew each other as no one else could because they were the only ones who knew what they'd thrown away. Every kiss was flavoured with the salt of that loss. Every night they lay beside each other, two people pretending to be two other people, and in the darkness, sometimes she'd whisper Harry just to hear the name again, and he'd whisper back Etta like a prayer for who they used to be. Was this loyalty or loneliness? Love or prison? Maybe there's no difference. Maybe love is just the prison you choose. William Henry Long died in 1936, peacefully, prosperously, surrounded by family who knew him as a quiet mechanic who'd built a good life from nothing. No deathbed confessions disturbed his passing. The secret stayed locked behind his teeth even as his breath stopped. His children would remember a reserved man who seemed to carry some invisible weight, who sometimes stared at the horizon like he was watching for someone who never came. In those final moments, as William Henry Long took his last breath, he was two people dying at once. The relief of keeping the secret to the end mixed with something else. Regret, perhaps, for never being seen for who he really was. Harry Alonzo Longabore died that day, 28 years after the world thought he did, and this time there was no doubt about the body. While Long lived quietly in Utah, another ghost walked the West, and this one couldn't help himself. Throughout the 1910s and 20s, a man matching Butch Cassidy's description appeared across the American West like a recurring dream. Spokane mostly, but also Circleville, Utah, Butch's hometown, where appearing was both necessary and dangerous. He'd show up in saloons, buying drinks, telling Wild Bunch stories with a kind of details that made listeners lean in. The way a particular horse wheezed when it ran, the exact words spoken during the Wilcox train robbery, the smell of dynamite mixed with sagebrush. Then he'd disappear before anyone could pin him down, leaving behind only questions and bar tabs paid with old bills. He was testing the waters, seeing if anyone would recognize him. Part of him wanted to be caught, not by the law, but by recognition. To have someone, anyone, look him in the eye and say, "I know who you are." But Butch Cassidy was supposed to be dead, and the dead don't drink whiskey in Spokane. Enter William T. Phillips, a businessman in Spokane who appeared around 1908 with enough money to set himself up comfortably. He married, had a family, ran a machine shop, respectable, ordinary, forgettable. Except in the 1930s, Phillips began writing something dangerous, an autobiography of Butch Cassidy's life. He called it The Bandit Invincible, and it contained details that no one outside the Wild Bunch could know. Not just facts, but feelings, the weight of leadership, the calculus of choosing loyalty over logic, the exact thought that crossed Butch's mind when he realized the West had gotten too small. Why risk it? Why potentially expose himself after decades of successful hiding? Loneliness, the kind that eats you from inside, slowly, steadily, until you'd rather be caught than continue being no one. Phillips, if he was Cassidy, had survived his own death only to discover that survival isn't the same as living. Every day of being William Phillips was a day of not being Butch Cassidy, and Butch Cassidy was the only person he'd ever successfully been. But it was more than loneliness, it was guilt. If Phillips was Butch, then he carried a specific weight. He was the one who'd planned their disappearance, the leader who'd convinced Sundance that Bolivia was their only option, the friend who'd sentenced his partner to a lifetime of being William Henry Long, mechanic, instead of Harry Longabaugh, legend. In 1936, when Long died in Utah, there were reports of a stranger at the cemetery. An older man standing in the rain, hat pulled low, watching from a distance as they lowered the coffin. He didn't approach the family, didn't sign the register, just stood there in the rain like a ghost at his own funeral. When the service ended, he walked to the grave, stood there for a long moment, then left something small on the fresh earth. Witnesses couldn't agree what. A stone, maybe, or a coin. Something that meant nothing to anyone but him. Was it Phillips? Was it Butch saying goodbye to Sundance one last time, unable to mourn publicly the friend he'd officially lost 28 years earlier? The manuscript he'd been writing, was it apology? Confession? An attempt to resurrect in words the friend he'd helped bury in silence? Then there was Lula Parker Bettinson, Butch's younger sister, in 1975, at 90 years old. She finally broke her silence. She claimed Butch had come home in 1925, driving a new Model T, 17 years after Bolivia. He'd spent an evening with family, confirmed the Bolivia story was a planted lie, expressed grief over Sundance's death, which he claimed was real, though not in Bolivia, and promised to return. He never did. The family kept his secret, she said, and maintained contact until he died of pneumonia somewhere in the Pacific Northwest in 1937. The other siblings disagreed. His brother Dan was certain Butch died in South America. Their father, Maximilian, reportedly never spoke of any visit, but Lula held to her story until she died, and there was something in her certainty that suggested either absolute truth or the kind of lie you tell so long it becomes true in your heart. The money tells its own story. The Wild Bunch stole over $200,000, $7 million in today's money. Most of it was never recovered, but throughout the 1910s and 20s, property purchases appeared across the West. Names that didn't quite match, paid in cash that was curiously old, bills and gold coins from the 1890s. Someone was slowly, carefully, converting stolen money into legitimate assets. Someone who understood that the trick wasn't stealing the money, it was washing it clean, making it ordinary, making it invisible. The perfect window for disappearing was 1908. No federal fingerprint database existed until 1924. Social Security wouldn't come until 1936. Telegraph communication was spotty at best in rural areas. Photographs were easily misidentified. A man could walk from one life into another with just a change of clothes and a convincing story. Modern enough to move money across distances, primitive enough to vanish completely. Two men, two approaches to being dead. Sundance stayed buried, committed completely to his erasure, swallowing every story until they poisoned him with silence. Butch kept circling back, unable to resist the pull of who he'd been, leaving breadcrumbs for anyone who cared to follow. One mastered invisibility. The other discovered that escaping death meant living in a kind of death, and some part of him was still fighting it. History loves to celebrate the loyalty between Butch and Sundance, two friends who died together rather than surrender, backs against the wall, defiant to the end. It's the kind of loyalty that makes legends, the kind that sells movie tickets and names film festivals. But what if the loyalty was to something else entirely? What if it was to the plan? Think about the trust required to fake your own death with someone else. You're not just trusting them with your life. You're trusting them with your death. One word to the wrong person, one moment of weakness, one drunken confession, and the whole elaborate fiction collapses. The loyalty between Butch and Sundance, if they survived Bolivia, wasn't just friendship. It was mutual assured destruction. They held each other's annihilation in their hands every day for decades, and never let go. That's not friendship. That's something deeper and more terrible. It's the intimacy of shared deception, the bond of mutual graves. But here's what they betrayed in exchange for that loyalty: themselves. Butch Cassidy wanted recognition. He was a showman at heart, the kind of outlaw who'd tip his hat to the engineers of trains he was robbing, who'd leave notes for the Pinkertons that were equal parts taunt and performance. He didn't just want to steal, he wanted to be known for stealing. The plan, if he designed it, forced him to kill that part of himself, to become William Phillips or whoever else, ordinary, forgotten, successful only in being unsuccessful at being remembered. Sundance wanted peace. By 1908, he was tired of running, tired of looking over his shoulder, tired of the weight of fame he'd never asked for. The plan gave him that peace. William Henry Long lived quietly for 28 years, but peace came at the price of identity. He got to stop running by ceasing to exist as the person who'd been running. And Etta, she wanted adventure and stability both. The thrill of the outlaw life and the safety of settling down. She got both and neither. Mrs. Long had a stable life in Utah, a respectable existence, but every stable day was built on unstable foundation, every moment of safety shadowed by the possibility of exposure. She lived the adventure of being ordinary, which is no adventure at all. They didn't die in Bolivia, but those versions of themselves did. Robert Leroy Parker died in that boarding house, even if his body walked out. Harry Longabaugh died there too, even if his heart kept beating for decades. Etta Place vanished into history, even if a woman who knew her secrets lived on. 3 strangers were born in their place, and that might be the cruelest con of all, the one they pulled on themselves. The industries that hunted them certainly got what they needed. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, which had hemorrhaged money and credibility chasing ghosts, desperately needed those ghosts to be buried. $50,000 spent, years of man-hours, the entire reputation of America's premier detective agency, all of it demanded corpses. When bodies appeared in Bolivia, they closed the file with remarkable speed. No one asked hard questions, no one demanded photographs. The relief in their offices must have been palpable. The sound of ledgers finally closing. The Union Pacific Railroad wrote off their losses and moved on. The hole in their finances was nothing compared to the hole in their pride that would have festered if Butch and Sundance had simply vanished. They needed an ending to sell to their investors, their insurers, their mythology of inevitable corporate triumph. The Bolivian government needed victory over the Yankee bandits to prove they could protect foreign mining interests. Dead outlaws were good for business. Living ones were not. Everyone needed them dead. Butch and Sundance gave them what they needed. It was perhaps their most generous robbery. They stole themselves from history and gave history the bodies it required. But consider what they left behind. Not just money or fame, but family. Butch's mother, Annie Parker, died in 1905, 3 years before Bolivia. She died believing her eldest son was damned, that the boy she'd raised in the Mormon faith had chosen perdition. If Butch survived, if he became Phillips or anyone else, he let his mother die in that grief rather than risk a word of comfort. Could he have snuck to her funeral, stood in the back of that Mormon church in Circleville, hat in hand, watching his siblings mourn both their mother and their lost brother? Maybe he did. Maybe that's one of those Cassidy sightings that couldn't be confirmed. An older man at the back of the church, tears on his face, leaving before anyone could approach. Or maybe he stayed away, knowing that his presence would be the cruelest kind of kindness, letting them know he was alive but could never truly return. Sundance's family in Pennsylvania read about his death in newspapers. Siblings who'd watched their brother drift west like smoke now had to imagine him dying in a Bolivian shootout, body unmarked and unrecovered. If he lived as William Henry Long, he chose to let them carry that grief rather than ease it with truth. The silence compounded over years. Every year they didn't speak made the next year harder. How do you write to a sister after 5 years of being dead? After 10? After 20? How do you explain that you love them enough to die, but not enough to let them know you lived? Picture this. Somewhere in the late 1920s, a diner in some small western town. 2 old men sit at a corner table, coffee growing cold between them. They've met before, always in different towns, always carefully random. They don't use names. They talk around things rather than about them. One asks about family, the kind of question that means nothing and everything. The other responds that they're good, returns the inquiry. They discuss business in the vaguest possible terms. Steady, can't complain, getting by. The conversation is so ordinary it hurts, and underneath this mundane exchange, an entire hidden dialogue screams to be heard. Every bland pleasantry carries the weight of real questions they can't ask. Are you still buried? Still dead? Still holding the line? They can't reminisce about the old days. The walls might have ears. Can't mention Bolivia. Trains. The Wild Bunch. Can't be Butch and Sundance even to each other. They're just 2 old men who happen to know each other, happening to have coffee, happening to share a secret that's eating them both from inside. One of them, let's say it's Phillips, let's say it's Butch, might lean forward slightly. Ever think about? And then stop, because finishing that sentence would be admitting too much. Ever think about what? Telling someone? Writing it down? Going home? The other, let's say it's Long, let's say it's Sundance, would just shake his head. Not because he doesn't think about it, because thinking about it is all he does. They'd part after 20 minutes. Handshake firm but brief. No plans to meet again. But somehow they would in another year, another town, another corner table. 2 ghosts haunting each other because they're the only ones who remember when they were alive. When Long died in 1936, Phillips, if he was Butch, lost the last person who knew who he really was. Imagine carrying that alone. The last witness to your true self. Gone. You're not just the last of the Wild Bunch now. You're the last person who knows the Wild Bunch existed as anything more than newspaper stories and dime novel legends. Maybe that's why the manuscript became so important. The Bandit Invincible wasn't just Butcher's story. It was proof that Butch had existed, that somewhere under William Phillips was Robert Leroy Parker, that the boy from Circleville who'd become the most famous outlaw in America was still there, still fighting to be remembered, even if only on pages no one might ever read. The real betrayal wasn't of the law. They'd been betraying that since they learned it was written by the wealthy for the wealthy. It wasn't of their families, though that betrayal cut deep and scarred permanent. It wasn't even of each other, though the weight of shared secrets must have felt like betrayal some days. The real betrayal was of themselves, of the men they might have been if they'd turned left instead of right at any of 1,000 crossroads. They betrayed the parts of themselves that wanted to be known, celebrated, remembered. They betrayed their own stories, and in return, they got to live. If you can call it living, they created a myth that outlasted them. The myth of their death in Bolivia became more real than their lives after Bolivia. They wrote themselves out of history so perfectly that even now, we can't be certain. Did William Henry Long have that scar by coincidence? Was William Phillips just a fantasist who studied Cassidy so deeply he convinced himself he was him? Was Lula Parker Bettenson protecting a truth or creating one? We'll never know, and that uncertainty, that permanent question mark, might be their greatest con. They didn't just rob banks and trains. They robbed history of certainty. They robbed death of its finality. They robbed themselves of themselves, and somehow made that robbery look like loyalty. Perhaps the tragedy isn't that they betrayed anyone. Perhaps it's that they were so good at betrayal. They even betrayed the fact of betrayal itself, made it look like love, the love between Butch and Sundance, the loyalty unto death, the friendship that Hollywood immortalized. It was all true, and it was all a con, both things at once, like men who were dead and alive, like names that were real and fake, like lives that were lived and unlived simultaneously. That's not cynicism, that's tragedy, the kind where you win and still lose, the kind where you survive and still die, the kind where you escape everything except yourself. So here we are, two endings, neither certain. In one, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid die in a blaze of gunfire in Bolivia, loyal to the end, defiant against impossible odds. The bullets find them, the blood pools beneath them, and they pass into legend clean and clear as mountain water. That's the ending Hollywood gave us. Paul Newman and Robert Redford frozen in sepia, forever young, forever brave, forever about to die. In the other ending, two men walk away from those bodies in San Vicente. They board different trains to different lives. They spend decades as other people, growing old in ordinary ways, dying in beds instead of gunfights. William Phillips passes in 1937, William Long in 1936, and nobody connects them to the myths they used to be. Which ending is true? The evidence points both ways and neither way, like tracks that split in the desert and both fade into dust. But maybe the question isn't whether they died in Bolivia. Maybe it's what they sacrificed to become legendary. Because either way, dead in San Vicente or alive in hiding, they paid the same price. They gave up the ability to be themselves. If they died as Butch and Sundance but lost everything else. If they lived, they got everything else but lost Butch and Sundance. Consider the mathematics of their choice. They stole over $200,000 across their career. In exchange, they paid with their names, their families, their histories, their ability to sit in a bar and tell their own stories. They paid with every sunset they couldn't share with loved ones, every achievement they couldn't celebrate, every moment of recognition they had to deflect or avoid. Was it worth it? William Henry Long, the quiet mechanic in Utah, lived 28 years as nobody special. 28 years of Sunday dinners where he couldn't speak. 28 years of watching his legend grow in newspapers and novels while he fixed engines and counted ordinary money. If he was Sundance, he traded the excitement of being an outlaw for the exhaustion of pretending he never was. William Phillips, the businessman in Spokane, spent nearly 30 years wearing another man's life like an ill-fitting suit. If he was butch, he discovered that surviving your own death is just another kind of dying. Slower, quieter, but just as final. The love between them, if they both survived, becomes something even more complex than Hollywood imagined. It wasn't just the bond of shared danger, it was the bond of shared erasure. They held each other's truth for decades, the only witnesses to each other's real selves. Every year of silence strengthened that bond and deepened that burden. They couldn't betray each other without betraying themselves. They couldn't free each other without destroying everything they built. That's love, perhaps. Or maybe it's just mutual imprisonment with good intentions. Their families carried secrets or questions to their own graves. Children grew up with fathers who had no past, or with uncles who existed only in legend. Siblings aged, wondering if that stranger at the back of the church was who they thought it might be. The Parker family and the Longabaugh family became keepers of mysteries they couldn't solve or speak. The Pinkertons closed their files and counted it a win. The Union Pacific moved on to other thieves, other problems. Bolivia got its story of frontier justice. Hollywood got its perfect ending. Everyone got what they needed except the men themselves, who got to disappear so completely that even they might have forgotten who they'd been. Here's what haunts me most about this story. Somewhere in the late 1920s or early 30s, two old men are sitting on separate porches in separate states, watching separate sunsets. They're both thinking about Bolivia, either the place they died or the place they pretended to die. They're both wondering if it was worth it. They're both wishing they could tell someone, anyone, the truth of it. But they don't. They sit in their rocking chairs, William Phillips and William Henry Long, and they watch the sun go down on another day of being nobody, another day of successful hiding, another day of being ghosts in their own lives. Maybe one of them thinks about writing a letter. Maybe he even starts it. Dear Harry, or Dear Leroy. But what would he say? What words could capture the weight of all that silence? How do you write to someone who doesn't exist about a life you never lived? The letter never gets written. The words never get spoken. The truth never gets told. And that's their legacy. Not the robberies, not the shootouts, not even the loyalty. Their legacy is the question mark, the permanent uncertainty, the space between history and legend where they still live, still die, still ride forever through a West that no longer exists. They gave us a mystery that can never be solved because they made sure all the evidence pointed both ways. Every fact that proves they died can be countered by a fact that suggests they lived. Every sighting that proves they survived can be explained as wishful thinking or mistaken identity. They robbed us of certainty, and maybe that was the point. Maybe they looked at the way the world was going. Telephones and automobiles, fingerprints and federal agents, the closing of the frontier and the opening of the surveillance state, and decided the only freedom left was to become unknowable, to exist in the space between fact and fiction, to be quantum outlaws, dead and alive simultaneously until someone opens the box, which no one ever can. Let the campfire in your mind burn down to embers. Let the questions drift like smoke into the darkness. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid are out there somewhere, in unmarked graves in Bolivia, in documented cemeteries in Spokane and Utah, in the gap between what we know and what we wish, in the place where legends go to live forever. They won, they lost, they escaped, they were trapped, they died young, they grew old, they were loyal to the end, they betrayed everyone, including themselves. All of it's true. None of it's true. That's the beauty of a perfect con. Even the mark never knows for sure if they've been taken. Close your eyes, listen to the wind across the sage. Somewhere out there, two ghosts are riding through the darkness. Forever young, forever old, forever dead, forever alive. They're heading for a horizon they'll never reach, carrying secrets they'll never tell, being men they never were and always will be. sleep well. The mystery keeps them alive. The uncertainty is their immortality. And in your dreams tonight, maybe you'll see them, not as they were, but as they wanted to be. Free, unknown, invisible, gone.